Welcome to the Great Beer State podcast from the Michigan Brewers Guild. The Great Beer State is a weekly show sharing conversations and stories from the passionate people who contribute to our vibrant Michigan beer community. It is made up of a mix between full-length archived interviews from the Guild's first documentary book project, A Rising Tide, Stories from the Michigan Brewers Guild, and conversations recorded in the here and now. Each episode is kicked off with a conversational update from host Scott Graham, Executive Director of the Guild, and the beer-evangelist Fred Biltman, author of A Rising Tide. Here's Scott and Fred. Welcome to episode 8 of Michigan's Great Beer State podcast, brought to you by the Michigan Brewers Guild. My name's Fred. I'm here with Scott Graham, Executive Director of the Guild. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Fred. It's good to be back for another episode of the Great Beer State podcast. Looking forward to it.
Yes, me too. So we've got Ray Sherwood as our guest interview today, recorded from the here and now via Zoom. And we'll look forward to that in a little bit. In the meantime, we like to give some updates from around the state and what's happening. Spring is starting to look towards summer a little bit, glimmer of hope. Improved weather and a little bit of improved environment for our brewery restaurateurs as well. What else do you have going on?
Well, we're looking at vaccines, hitting a milestone of 55% of the eligible population, which means that in 2 weeks from basically now, as we record this, businesses will be able to go back to, offices will be able to go back to having in-person work, which is great for breweries that are in a community that has lots of that kind of traffic. That should really help. Events this summer, some of them are starting to happen. We now know that our summer beer festival in Ypsilanti will not take place for the second year in a row, but I'm kind of excited to be developing some alternative plans to host kind of substitute and different festivals in August. So we're just kind of announcing that we've got tentative plans for a festival at the ballpark in Comstock Park, where we normally do our winter beer festival, and also at the Traverse City ballpark, which is Turtle Creek Stadium, where we've been talking about doing a festival for 2 years, but haven't actually done it. So that's new news, and we may not be able to go through with those plans, but we're hopeful that we can, and that we can also see the UP Fall Beer Festival in Marquette.
All right. So beer festival loving public, you're eyeballing 2 to 3 festivals starting in August with Grand Rapids, Traverse City, and Marquette on the horizon. And Summer Beer Festival in Ypsilanti is off the table. Just to paraphrase and summarize for those keeping score, that has a collection of sort of, it's sad to see Ypsi off the books, but it's understandable. And that's a little bit of optimism to see some festivals that have a conversation and a chance of happening. So we'll hope for the best. And I take it there's some registrations for the golf outings out there as well?
Yeah, our first golf outing in June, on June 11th, is nearly full of golfers. As we talk, there might be one opening for a team left. There's still sponsorship opportunities. And as soon as we kind of get that one buttoned up, we'll be opening registration for the event in August, the golf outing in August, that will be in East Lansing. So looking forward to doing those golf outings and seeing a few people in a relaxed outdoor fun environment.
Excellent. And, the purpose of these updates isn't to get into all these issues necessarily, but I think it's also important. This is the section where I like to encourage everybody to be aware of what's going on in the industry and where we're kind of documenting it. I think a statewide, industry-wide, meaning restaurants and breweries and brew pubs, everybody's having some really challenging staff shortages, and a lot of everybody's getting back to being open, and outdoor dining is coming, indoor dining is coming, and people that are providing those services have a really uphill challenge in terms of logistics that aren't normally there. So that's going to deliver some inconveniences to consumers. And I think this is just our place to encourage our brewery beer loving folks to be kind and be patient and be part of the process that helps work through this. And let's just start a little, PSA for being kind to those that are working hard to bring us beer and food in person.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great point.
Yeah, a lot of worn out people there working hard for our benefit. So we'll keep them in mind, and that seems like a good time to head over to the Brewers Dozen, our tradition of giving shout out to member breweries across the state. Scott, you want to give us a start and let us know about the region you picked?
Yeah, so we're looking at a cluster of breweries that kind of go from Flint and come down south through Fenton, including Holly, Brighton, and then reaching out to South Lyon, which is a little south. So it's this strip in the outlying area northwest of the Metro Detroit area. And we'll get started in Howell. There's a cluster of breweries in Howell. It's actually, for not a real big place, they got a good group of breweries, and one of them is Aberrant Ales.
All right, which is followed by Block Brewing Company. And that is their Howell location.
And Eternity Brewing Company. Correct. Eternity Brewing Company is also in Howell.
As well as Heartland Brewing Company.
At least that's Heartland Brewing Company. Their address is Howell. So I recognize that it's pushing it a little bit. If we move over to nearby Brighton, there is Brewery Becker, which is right downtown.
And then we've got Block Brewing Company's Brighton location.
Yes, and if we imagine ourselves traveling north to Flint, there's Tenacity Brewing.
As well as Redwood Brewing Company, a very long time member.
Yeah, and Fenton is home to Fenton Winery and Brewery.
And Lynchpin Beer Company.
And then we have Northern Oak Brewery, which is in Holly.
And then we head over to South Lyon, and we've got Witch's Hat Brewing Company.
And we wrap it up today with Third Monk Brewing Company, that is also in South Lyon. So
all right, so
have some beer.
Yeah, right on. That's the Brewers Dozen. Head out and see what they got going on. I think we're still in a point where the other suggestion is to check everybody's hours, check their dining situation. Lots of changes happening here in the spring, both with restrictions changing, with the weather changing. So everybody's been pretty awesome about getting their stuff out online, whether they're to go, indoors, outdoors, which days of the week, all that stuff requires a little more planning than it used to. But check it out and give them a visit. So today's guest is Ray Sherwood, and he and his wife Lisa opened Sherwood Brewing Company in Shelby Township, and I really enjoyed the interview. I like what they had to say. I think that hearing about his background and kind of where he was in the early 2000s, moving through a handful of breweries before getting their own place open was a great look back.
Excuse me. Yeah,
that's all right.
I learned a few things about Ray that I didn't know in his operation. One of the things he talked about that really struck me was when they were planning the brewery, he and his wife Lisa, Ray came at it from a brewing background, like so many people do, but he really felt the need to focus on the other elements of a hospitality operation, such as, atmosphere and food and service. It was a real priority for him. And I think that was insightful and wise then. And I think it's equally as important today. The hospitality aspect of your brewery tasting room is why people come, and beer is a big part of it. But it's one part. So I enjoyed hearing Ray talk about that.
Yeah, you really heard the idea of cultivating regulars and giving people a place to hang out and socialize, being and have, and he had a certain feel in mind. They had a certain feel in mind that they were going for, and that then impacted how they set themselves up and what they offered. I really liked hearing that, including like, hey, we don't mind. We want people to come be able to hang out here for several hours instead of feeling like the table's got to turn. And that's that's a tavern mentality, which I think is common in the brewery landscape, but it's a tavern mentality versus a restaurant while they're also acting as a restaurant. He does a great job of sharing that mindset. And I think that just good to hear from him. Also, you could hear how that approach and that relationship they have with their customers showed up in the pandemic in a big way. That you could hear his appreciation, and you could hear how the regulars really showed up to support Sherwood. That's encouraging this day and age.
Yeah, it really is. And well, you said it well. He feels like his regulars are coming out more, not less, and I'm sure that that's a conscious effort because they appreciate what Sherwood has been to their community for so many years.
Absolutely. So that's the setup. We'll head over to Shelby Township and introduce you to Ray Sherwood. Take it away.
Cheers, Ray.
Welcome, Ray, to Michigan's Great Beer State podcast. Great to see you.
Continue.
Thanks. We've been sharing stories and kind of hearing how people got into this crazy community, and I'd love to hear the origin story for Sherwood Brewing and how you and Lisa got started and how you came into the world of beer. If you don't mind starting there, it'd be great.
Sure. I guess I started homebrewing back in the 90s. I had some friends that were doing it and kind of jumped in and started helping them out, and kind of got more and more into it as time went on. Worked briefly when I first got out of college at Michigan State University, or not Michigan State, I'm sorry, Michigan Brewing Company. After I graduated from State, and worked there, sales and bartending and stuff like that. And then from there, I went and actually worked in my field for a couple of years. And when that fizzled out, I went and I got a job at Harper's in East Lansing, just helping Scott out, mucking grains and stuff. And then eventually we moved back down towards the Detroit area. And once we were down here, I kind of had a bug in my ear about starting my own place, and somehow I managed to talk Lisa into it. When I was working at Coonan Brewing Company, and she got to see a place where the owners were there, they were hand on, and they kind of did it themselves, and it was eye-opening for her. So when she saw their success with doing it, it kind of opened her eyes that we could maybe do our own thing, and so we started working on Sherwood Brewing Company.
Nice. And so what year would you say you started to kick that idea around? And then how did that translate to actually getting into planning and making it happen?
In the back of my head, I kind of knew I wanted my own place, but that was, as a home brewery. And I think that home brewer dream back there somewhere in your head where you're thinking about it. But when I started working at Coonan was, I think, about 2003. And when we started working on our own plan and actually writing up a business plan and trying to find a location for it was about 2005. And then, right at the end of 2005 is when we started working with landlords and getting a letter of intent signed and moving to the next phase, which was licensing and build out. So we opened it in 2006.
In 2006. And how does that translate to your first brewing job back at, which I think you said was at Michigan Brewing Company?
That was my first job in a brewery, just as a bartender and doing whatever they needed to do. My first actual brewing job at Harper's was 2002.
Okay, great.
Helping.
So, thanks for sharing. It sounds like you always had this idea as soon as you started making beer that wouldn't it be great? When you start getting into licensing and getting open, what did that feel or look like in terms of, now you have a place, that you're about to open the doors and let people in. What is that transition like for you?
That was a long time ago to remember, but it's definitely a kind of an interesting experience because you go from, as a home brewer and trying to, and even, at that point I was an assistant brewer at Coonan, you're kind of really focused on this is what I want to do for this beer. This is what I want to do that, how I want to have my brown ale and my red ale, or, it's very focused on the creative process. And then you start to get into the nuts and bolts of opening a place, and, that responsibility element starts to weigh in. And, just even, as you get close to it, you're like, okay, well, now I need to, start developing recipes for this brew system and balance them out and trying to figure out, oh, hey, this is what I used when I made a 5-gallon batch. And, is that feasible? Can I, how does that translate to 230 gallons? It's, the math and science part of the brain has to kind of kick in at some point and lend a hand and do some of the heavy lifting as you're going through that. So, I feel fortunate that I worked at a place at Coonan where, you could pretty much experiment any way you wanted with stuff. But they also had, they had a grown kettle that you could do, 100-gallon mash. They had their big system that was, 250 gallons. And then they had their little brew on premise system, which was 20-gallon batches. So there was a lot that you could see there. And, every part of that had a different type of brewing system or different, method of brewing that you can kind of work out. And, it was a wide range of experience there.
Yeah. And so I can see where there's decisions about, okay, you got to experiment with all that stuff in somebody else's system. Now what am I going to do? And how am I going to translate all that into the system you did choose?
Yeah.
Would you say there were so besides the brewing side, when you start talking about the space and customer contact, what were the other hallmarks that you were hoping to see in terms of Sherwood? Like what made up the imagined DNA of the place you're trying to create? Were there any, big thoughts in terms of that would describe the place you wanted it to become?
Yeah, there's a lot of different aspects that kind of went into it, I honestly, I didn't have this is what we're going to open up day one and this is what the tasting room is going to be like. We did know that customer service was going to be extremely important to us. Cause I'd been going to bars for 15 years at that point. And you kind of, at some point you start thinking critically of it, what did I like about this experience? What didn't I like about that experience? And so my wife and I had kind of a mindset where, at that age for brew pubs, you couldn't not have great customer service, and you couldn't not provide good quality food, and then you couldn't, the beer had to speak for itself. So all three of those things kind of had to be dialed in. As far as what the tasting room would go and the atmosphere, I think some of that, having lived in a college town, I like that college town feel for a bar. We weren't going to be kind of a big flashy chain place. It was going to be kind of a, comfortable, I don't know how to describe it, but I think a college town bar has a different kind of a feel to it. And not necessarily like, I think of all the different bars in East Lansing, you have there's a variety of bars there, but there's always a good handful of bars, which are like the kind of hangout bars where, people go in there to not have that crazy bar atmosphere. They go in there where it's going to be a little bit chill, a little bit mellow. There's going to be band playing a couple nights a week. And you get to know the people that work there and, have kind of a relationship with them. And that was kind of a big component of it, having that where, servers are going to be comfortable with their guests, and, they're not just patrons and guests, they're regulars, treat everybody like a regular and have a comfort level where, you can sit down and talk to them while you're waiting on them. If, it doesn't have to be the white press shirt and black pants with an apron. It's going to be, a casual, I'm wearing a beer shirt and I'm comfortable talking to you about what you want to drink. And then I'm going to ask you a question about your kids or, your wife or whatever. And it's going to be this normal conversation, like a casual thing that I think you get in those college town bars, because people are coming in from everywhere and all walks of life. And you kind of have an openness to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so it makes me think about, your location too. What drew you to Shelby Township, and how did those ideas sort of translate, and how did you sort of merge what you came from to where you were opening?
I mean, there was a need in that area, so I think that was the first thing where you're like, when we first moved back to the area, we had family down this way. And so that was the main draw for geographically to the northern Macomb area, or southern Macomb, northern Sterling Heights area. And that was kind of like the convenience of that location. But when we got out here, there was nothing craft beer wise. I think they had a Champs on Hall Road, which is the main restaurant corridor that we're near. And even at that, they had, a casual craft beer lineup. They didn't have anything in the way of locals. They didn't have, hard to get beers or anything like that. They just had your typical, like, you can find Sam Adams. They might have a Goose Island's seasonal liqueur there from, Red Hook or something like that, whatever the bigs were pushing, and that you can get in a lot of other restaurants. But outside of that, most of the restaurants in the area didn't even have a single craft beer on. So it just seemed like, okay, well, there's a bit of a vacuum here for craft beer, and they're, demographically, it's like we're in an area with families very similar to ours. And we knew that, we were part of that craft beer group. And if other people were like us, we'd be able to figure that out and find people that were interested in craft beer in our area. So that was kind of, it made it kind of convenient to like look at our own backyard and say, okay, well, we don't have this and we think we can make this work.
Yeah. And that can be, that process of sort of looking around and surveying that canyon, that gap where something isn't offered can be a huge opportunity. And it can also be a little scary of like, I think it's an interesting coin where you look at this either means it's failed before, or there's somebody waiting for me to show up and offer this. And that can be an interesting moment. How did you feel that, going into your first year or two, what was the response from the community like?
I mean, we got both sides of that coin. We definitely had, as we're doing our build out, a lot of nose prints on the window. We put signs up on the window, coming soon. And, we would, every day we'd be in there working and, painting and doing all these different things. And you'd have to stop maybe a half dozen times every day just to explain to people, hey, we're working on it. We'll be open soon. And a lot of people definitely excited about it. So once we got open, we find out that there's, definitely a very active homebrew club in the area. There's definitely a lot of people, young families that are, moved home from after going to college and are definitely looking for a craft beer experience that was missing from our area. And then we also have a lot of people that would come in and would be like, well, why don't you have Budweiser? Why don't you have, just give me a Jack Daniels and Coke? We didn't have that. So it was like a bit of an uphill battle on that side of it, where, you'd have people that definitely sought you out and were excited that you were there. And then for anybody else, you had a lot of education to do and a lot of palates to open up and minds to open up to trying something different that, you can different than what you could find everywhere else,
Yeah. And I imagine you'd been part of those conversations before at different places in your travels. Did you feel like there was a lot of progress through that it was moving in the right direction right away, or did it feel sort of at your schedule, slower, faster? But I imagine, you had a comparative viewpoint to see what it looked like here versus elsewhere.
I don't think it tracked as slowly as you might think. I think there was always some percentage that was going to come in and not have, not really understand what you were doing or what you're trying to do. But for the most part, most people were pretty willing to, at least give it a try. And the people that did, I think because everything else was so different in the place as far as the type of service, the quality of service, the feeling of camaraderie with our regulars and our Mugless Club members, that it definitely felt like a different place. It wasn't like everybody's in a rush to get in and out, like people are hanging out. It is, we kind of toe the line between restaurant and brew pub and bar, where on a Friday or Saturday night, we might have a table come in at 5 o'clock and then leave at close time. Not because they're, totally blotto and wasted, but because they've just been hanging out, talking to friends all night. We're not like the kind of place that's going to turn and burn tables and just try to get people in and out of there as fast as possible. And I think people recognize that right away, that it was a different atmosphere. And even if, the beer was kind of like the new thing for them, the experience was enough to make them, okay, well, this isn't what I'm used to drinking, but I'm definitely interested in, hanging out and having some fun here. And, before you know it, they're telling me like, oh, I went to a party and all they had was, Miller Lite. And I was like, suddenly they realized that they liked beer with flavor. And it was kind of changing their minds about like where they were at as far as what their feelings were about craft beer. And then suddenly it was just like that whole craft beer went through that kind of, I don't want to call it a rebirth thing, but it kind of went through a phase where suddenly everybody knew about craft beer and it wasn't that weird 6-pack in the back of a cooler. It was like, it was the normal. It was the new normal for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a wild shift that continues to develop. And, but I remember that as well, when it just seemed like, I don't know, it just changed gears in terms of its oddball status into it's still an oddball, but now it's a known oddball.
I actually have a theory on that, is that I think that craft beer had more or less turned 21 at that point.
Yeah.
Everybody that grew up or started drinking beer in the like around 2010 to 2015 or so, they'd kind of grown up and craft beer was always there. Craft beer was kind of normal to them.
Yeah.
And when they the beer drinking market at the age of 21, they didn't have that. Their main beer to go to wasn't Bud Light, Coors Light, or Miller Light. It was, they were suddenly Oberon seemed like an okay, normal thing to them.
Yeah, well, interesting that you put that to 21, because I have an adjacent theory that I hadn't thought about in a while, but I remember touting it back then, is when your parents, the parents' beer started to change. That, our parents' beer that we might nick out of the garage was like old style, were these, for me, and like it was these big heritage macro brews. And when kids coming of age and going to college were going to their parents' fridges and there were craft beers in there, that was a different wave of change, because they weren't aware of a world without craft beer. It was always there from their point of view. And, from my point of view, it was not there and then it was there. So I had a timeline that had a major difference. And I think things started to change when 21-year-olds started saying, this has always been here. I don't know a world without craft. Maybe that's from nicking their parents' beers. I don't know, but
yeah, it's the scenery for them, where for it was kind of like that, like that. It could be. I remember Stroh's Signature with a gold foil. I was always kind of like that super cool beer in the fridge that I always wanted to try.
Yeah, there you go. So I want to connect to, like, a lot of the things we talk about is sort of the community at large, and how your brewery and the story intersects with Michigan brewing community or the Michigan Brewers Guild. And I think it's interesting, because you really illustrate, I refer a lot to the fact that we're an apprentice industry and there's a lot of people learning alongside existing businesses and brewers. And so I'm wondering, having been at, 3 different breweries in a very formative time in our community, what was it like to go out on your own? And what, I guess I'm partly leaning towards, what was the community response, and like the brewers you had been at, what was that response to seeing you step out and go on your own? What was the community support or conversation like?
It was such a brotherhood back then, and I don't think it's any less of a brotherhood now, but I feel like back then we were so close knit, it was so small at that point. Now it just feels huge, I remember going to the first couple of beer festivals and getting there, and it seemed like I knew everybody by name, even though I was just an assistant brewer at a couple different places. But right when we were doing our build out, Mr. Coonan, I don't know, Eric Sr., he helped kind of show me the ropes on being a general manager or a general contractor. And he found me a lot of my subcontractors to help get our project going physically off the ground. So he helped us, at the very beginning of that process. And Eric and Brett were always willing to lend a hand or an ear if I had any issues to work out. I think the second batch of beer I brewed on my system, I brewed it with Scott from Harper's, who kind of taught me how to do all the different, turnkey brewing system things. And then at that same time, I bought my brew system at an auction from a hops restaurant, and there was a brew pub going into Clawson, which is, maybe 20 minutes away, maybe a half an hour away, depending on the time of the drive. And he had the exact same style of system. And, hey, this guy from here asked a question about your system, kind of put us in touch with one another. And, we always had that same experience at the same exact time, because we were going through construction at the same time. We were trying to find contractors to run steam pipe for us, or to fix our boilers and make sure everything was working into code. And, we would be on the phone at least once or twice a week trying to say, who's helping you out with this now? And, and we managed to kind of get through that experience together. And I just think it was, kind of like everybody was all in on it. And it was like a kind of a grassroots thing. We were excited that anybody was looking to open up a brewery anywhere. And I remember a couple of different brewers coming out and, on our opening day and stopping in to say hi. Todd Parker, I had never met him before that point formally, and he came in and had some beers, and gotten to really know him over the years as being a huge part of the community as he's moved out and come back, and is still part of the community today. And it's just, yeah, it's been a fun thing to be a part of, even as we watched it kind of, grow what seems like exponentially over the last decade, where it's every time you're like, wait, where are you from? Where's that town? I don't even know where that town is, and there's all these new, and, I think it's kind of neat because sometimes we kind of associate locations now by the brewery. Somebody says, well, I'm from where, this little town. You're like, I don't even know what that is. And you're like, oh, well, Starcraft Brewery's there. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. That's up, just north here. It's only for you to keep back the breweries than it is the little town names.
Yeah. Yeah. I love watching that grow and watching, breweries become sort of Main Street in these small towns, and towns of all different sizes, but becoming that part of that pulse again. And I think it's helped a lot of different ways. I think it's encouraged a lot of travel, and maybe that leads into another question, is like, how did your world change when now you've got this this location that calls for your time all the time, and how have you balanced getting out and seeing other breweries, or how have you engaged with the growth since you've been open and established, and what are your beer travels look like?
Sadly, that is kind of like the thing that might take the biggest hit when it comes to getting out and stuff. Like owning a place is always, it's a 24-hour a day, 365-day a year kind of a job. We're even on, I could be out on vacation out of town, you get the phone on, you're thinking about, oh, hey, what day is today, who's working, that's always somewhere in the back of your head. And when it comes to it, a lot of, even breweries that are relatively close or easy to get to, I'm at the pub nowadays, or, at the brewery, at the restaurant operating. Most of the times they would be normal times to go out, check out these other places, things, weekends, those times are all kind of locked up with your own place. So when customers start talking about new local places, like, places that are opening up, like Arctic Circle, or Loaded Dice just opened up recently, and people, have you been there? Have you checked it out yet? And it's like, sadly, no. It's like I haven't, made time to go do it, and then it is kind of a hard thing with a family to like, oh, well, I've been at work for 60 hours this week. I'm going to take my day off, and then I'm going to go hit another brew pub, and not work, but kind of be engrossed in that working environment. So we do try to, like, when we're not working, or we have a weekend off, or we go to do camping up north or something like that, we always kind of at least squeeze in one trip or a day, or in group, we'll kind of make our route go past somewhere where we haven't been before to check out a new pub. And we do that even out of state and everything like that. If we're driving to South Carolina, we know that, okay, well, we're going to stop in this town because there's a couple of brew pubs that we haven't seen there. And, still try to, have some craft beer travels when we can, but it definitely, the craft beer revolves around your own backyard nowadays.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's one of the things I love about the festivals, and have over the years, and it would sometimes disrupt. Like, I started thinking about that when you're talking about how where towns are based on their breweries. It's like sometimes I would have a very backwards view of that, because I met so many, in the same places at the festivals, where you're like, I know the brewery, the beer, and the people. I couldn't draw you a map because I've met them in Frog Island for consecutive years.
Yeah,
it's one of the, I think, helpful things is it developed a lot of connective tissue of people knowing each other when they can't necessarily get out all the time. But
I've definitely missed that here for sure.
Yeah. So I thought about leading us up to present day and talking about everything that's going on in the pandemic with a question prior to that, which is just saying, and it's maybe not a fair question, but you think about the change in the 14 years or so leading up to 2020. What were some of the big changes you guys went through as a brewery? What were the biggest shifts or successes, or anything that kind of a thumbnail sketch of then to now? And then, of course, we'll talk about the big one that everybody's had to deal with after that. But how would you say you guys grew or changed in leading up to 2020?
I think, starting off as like just a small brew pub and trying to figure things out on our own, and being where we're located with a lot of chain places, and we're out by a mall. There's another, people a lot of times, we're not like a touristy place where people are going to come down to, I don't want to say touristy, but like downtown Ann Arbor. They'll go down to downtown Ann Arbor and find a place to eat and drink and stuff like that. But we're in more of a bedroom community where people sometimes are only in their house to, sleep and eat. So it's a little bit different for us having to compete with, Applebee's, Champs, Boston's, and all those different things. And it took us a while to get established, but we kind of felt like once we did get established, it was like just maintaining, getting new regulars, trying to convert every new customer into a new regular. We experienced a lot of growth with that, especially as craft beer kind of started into its big growth period about a decade ago. But in that, I feel like we also experienced kind of some growing pains, and maybe a brew pub a pause in a ways where we had to kind of figure out and not just be part of the old scenery as new places started to come in, and there were a lot of new beers to come out there. So we kind of had to figure out, I don't want to say we had an identity crisis, but we kind of had to figure out how to make sure that we were still relevant and, go through a period where, oh, well, there's a new place that's got new food and new beers, is even our own regulars who are, big craft beer supporters, they want to go out and support all those other places. So it's like, you have to kind of find out to stay relevant and keeping everybody's ears. And, we definitely experienced some growing pains with that. So, every time there's like a new fad as far as, hard ciders coming on, hard seltzers, hard sodas, you kind of see it when you're out and about, sometimes more than you see it in your pub, because, what you might notice in your pub is, maybe not as busy a Friday night or Saturday night as you used to have. But then you go, out of town for a weekend, and then you see everybody walking around with, Mike's Hard Lemonades or Not Your Father's root beer and stuff like that. And you realize, okay, well, what's going on here? Craft beers not be as cool, or it's not the thing right now. And, you've got to get a way to get out there and get people to, come out for craft beer. And how do you do that? Do you change up your menu? Do you change up your entertainment? What kind of beer things can you do? What kind of beer events can you do? Because again, it's a beer event, it's a craft beer event, and that might not be what people are seeking out right at the moment. So yeah, it was an interesting market coming into 2020 as it was, because I feel like, seltzer then still kind of riding that wave of ironicness and attention, like, hey, I'm a big tough burly guy, I'm drinking a seltzer, but it's like, it's that trend, it used to be beer was that thing in a can. So it always had that, kind of grab and go kind of a feel that wine didn't have and hard liquor didn't have, because people aren't necessarily constantly, going out to a barbecue mixing hard liquor in a picnic area, they just grab a can of beer. Well, suddenly there was a lot more competition. So there's a lot changing at that time. And, we're just kind of going into the big change. We're just, always trying to adapt and try to pay attention and figure things out and be ready for the next thing. And then 2020 hit. And
Yeah.
kind of pulls the rug out of you no matter what point you're at.
Yeah. Talk
So
about
that
adapt.
was,
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think it's a great point to make that, there are already some bogeys out there and some trends that were pressing any brewery to work on adapting and looking, reflecting on their business and their brand and their identity. And then you get the biggest need to adapt overall. So that kind of leads us into a series of questions that we've been asking everybody. We call the last call questions. And the first one is that, is the pandemic, leading into that, how would you say, the pandemic and the shutdowns and all of it? I mean, it's a big question, but how has that sort of changed your business? Like, how did you adapt? And also, how has it affected your industry outlook looking forward from here? Kind of two halves of that question.
I think it's funny. It's obviously there, it feels like at the very beginning, such a negative thing. Being completely shut down, and it happened kind of quickly, where it was like, oh, hey, we might have some restrictions. And then all of a sudden it was like, no, that restriction is going to be carry out only. And then even at the beginning, I think there was a time period where we were afraid that was even going to be taken away from us. We were just going to be completely shuttered. But it was, that initial wave, the biggest challenge was, we went from a place that would do maybe a handful of carry out orders a week. We're primarily a dine-in place, to doing, having to figure out how to do a 100% carry out business. And that first couple months there was, every week was a different challenge. Like, oh, hey, I'm out of pizza boxes all of a sudden, because, that one pack of pizza boxes that might last me a month, I've gone through 3 in the last week. Then I go to the store to buy some more, and hey, it turns out that they're out of them too, so then you're like searching, trying to find resources, and everybody's competing, and it's suddenly that same market where everybody's using more of those, and different things would run out at different times, right. We're still actually experiencing some of that, because right now we can't get wings. I can't imagine a time or 20 where you would just be like, I have to tell your customers, like, you wings, because I can't buy wings myself to sell you. Like, I think nowadays you say that to somebody's like, okay, where 2 years ago somebody would have been like, well, I think you're an idiot if you don't think you can buy wings, and so you've gone through that learning curve of how to package up and what foods package up better and what things we need to take off the menu, because people just don't order that to go ever. And that was kind of a crazy immediate change. But on the other side of that is that even though we weren't a carry out place, is that it didn't take us but a day or two to start to have our customers adapt to that. And one of the biggest things, it was amazing how well supported we felt from our customers. Where when we were doing our curbside, we, and it's the stress of it is like, you have all these tickets and you're trying to make all this food all at the same time. But then home from media, customers are posting about, hey, look how exciting this is. Sherwood's is really busy. They've got this huge line and they're all excited about waiting in line. And not only are they understanding of it, they're kind of proud of what you're doing, proud that you're, making it. And I feel like in the last year, people have really come to appreciate their locally owned places. And yeah, when the Chick-fil-A opened up, they still had a line around the block for 2 months or whatever. But our customers definitely, I feel like our regulars in particular, have really kind of rallied around the craft beer industry in particular, but the brew pubs, the locally owned places. And, I think right now people eat out more than ever because they want to support these small businesses.
Yeah, that's great. And I hope that support and that appreciation from
it's like the positive or the silver lining in this for us.
Yeah. Sorry about that Zoom overlap there. Another adaptation we've all dealt with is digital delay occasionally showing up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hope that appreciation and sort of supportive, realizing the importance of our retail dollars as consumers. I hope that continues to be part of the mindset. I think that got stretched a bunch of different ways, and depending on which type of consumer you are. But I think if you're one that cares about your locals, you deepened your perspective a little bit throughout all this. So the next question is, the more you know. So what beer style do you feel most connected to? It's a little looser than a favorite beer question, but what style do you feel connected with, and what do you wish more people knew about it?
It's kind of like a seasonal thing for me. It's like typically when I go to a new place or a new pub that I haven't been to, I almost always look to see if they have a pale ale on tap, just a plain old good old fashioned American pale ale. And I feel like it's such an overlooked beer these days because everybody goes right for whatever the latest hottest trend in IPA is, that just the everyday drinking pale ale has been forgotten. But the other side of that is that throughout the year, I also feel the same way about porter because, those are the beers that I definitely order the most when I'm out and about. And when I have them on tap at the pub, that they're probably the ones that I drink the most on a regular basis. Porter, just because I think there's a lot more nuance to it than there would be with the stout. A stout can be, punched in the nose, robust, and roasted. But porters have a little bit more kind of complexity to them. There's a robust porter, there's a brown porter. Like right now we have a Baltic porter on, which is something I've wanted to do for years, but I didn't quite have the time that that COVID has afforded me to get one, to lager it and let it sit and mellow out and get that on tap. And it was a forgotten style for years. And I feel like even though it gained some popularity in craft beer, it's still kind of forgotten about a lot of times too.
Yeah. And I would put, porter and stout even in the same family. I appreciate the differences you mentioned, but also both of them are underbrewed right now. Like, I don't remember a time before now where you go into breweries and there's no dark roasty beer on at all. And I have these moments of like, I get a little anxious, like what's going on? One of these should be here. And it'll, that is an interesting thing. So I'm with you. Got to come your way and we'll drink some dark roasty beers.
Yeah, I think stout kind of suffers from the same thing that pale ale does too, which is that, when people do a stout, it's always like, oh, this is like a imperial,
right?
ABV stout that I aged in a bourbon barrel, and it's like, well, what about an everyday drinker, like
yeah.
Maybe a stout or, maybe even an export stout.
Absolutely. So next one's about your ideal home bar. Now, you may or may not have time to get there, but the idea is that with so many more people serving, drinking, enjoying beer at home, what's either your home bar setup like, or what would you recommend for somebody creating an ideal situation with a home bar for beer at home?
I don't have a home bar. I do have a beer fridge that is usually really well stocked with beers that I end up not drinking very much at home. I have some gems in my beer fridge, but when I get home, sometimes it's just like I'm just drinking a water and a decaf coffee before bed. I think I don't drink them very much, but I do definitely like fancier whiskeys and aged whiskeys. Aged Irish whiskeys, which you don't necessarily find out and about a lot. If I were building a bar and we bought our house, we bought a house that has a nice bar area set up in the basement. That's, it's still got to be built out, but it's like, oh, it's got a little alcove. It's perfect for, putting a bar in there. And obviously I'll imagine like a wet bar with a handful of seats and then a draft tower, but then I'm at all day long.
So one of your tips might be build it.
Yeah,
Make it happen. But I think even beer fridge, like even a beer fridge counts to me in terms of like, okay, having one is a good idea. And then, maintaining one, what I hear, if I'm going to help nudge you towards a tip, is like drinking through the beer fridge, thinking about how much do you move through. So what's appropriate to put in there? I think, I know I've fallen prey to the same thing where like, I've become a beer collector. I have beer that I haven't looked at for a while. That's not really the point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's definitely good advice. I find that having a nice variety of beers too, that's another thing I always overlook with my beer fridge is that, I have all of these like weird, sour ale from, this brewery or that brewery and, maybe some imperial stouts and barley wines and stuff like that. They sit in the fridge and they do fairly well sitting in there for a long time. But then, you have some family over and they're like, yo, what do you have for beer? And I'm like, oh, I don't even have like a regular drinking, brown ale, thing like that. And so, yeah, that's definitely. And then the other fun thing I have to clean it up and plug it back in is a 1970s Fago machine. We usually leave a bag of quarters on top of it and then, fill it with soda. And then I'll have one random beer row in there where it's like you just put a quarter in, you don't know what can of beer you're going to get out of it. But that's always fun during the summer.
That's fancy.
Yeah.
The Fago Lotto sort of, it's like, see which one comes out. The next one is love and hate. So what current trends do you love or do you hate? And how are they reflected or not in your brewery?
I've never been a fan of New England IPAs, so I'm still to date no New England IPA brewed or on tap ever. And we take our lumps for it. It's just I don't feel like it's a very balanced style. I don't feel like it offers a lot in character or flavor that a regular IPA doesn't already offer. And I feel like a regular IPA offers a lot more than the New England IPA as far as bitterness and I don't know. It just, I feel like you lose all your malt character on those. They just don't offer as much. They're kind of like a watered down version of a real IPA. So I haven't jumped on that bandwagon. So that's the hate side of it's probably very much that. As far as the trends that I like to see right now is, it's very kind of quietly happening, but I feel like lagers are coming back to style. And I know like my friends and I that, in the industry, we talk about, we're always comparing gears and sending pictures of what we're doing. And, lagers are always kind of like, what do you have there? Like that kind of a thing. So we always definitely get excited about it, but I noticed right before COVID, that was kind of like one of those things where there were a couple breweries putting out lagers and cans and stuff like that. I feel like they were starting to get some nice traction, and it was kind of like a comforting thing to see that, some of those styles, I feel like, again, they're kind of forgotten. Vienna lagers or, Munich Dunkels and some of those really flavorful lagers that, haven't been a thing in the United States are starting to get a little bit kind of a bit of a following.
Yeah. So next question is, do you remember your first drink? And, generally leaning towards alcoholic beverage of some sort. Do you remember your first one?
My first one? I honestly, I remember getting golfing with my dad when I was about 12 or 13 and getting like what we considered our first official sanctioned kind of a birdie on a regular golf course. And when we got back, my dad gave me a quarter of an ounce or half an ounce of Jameson.
All right.
And, I didn't want to have anything to do with whiskey for a while.
Oh yeah.
Harsh thing for my palate. But yeah, it was a little celebratory bit of whiskey. Outside of that, I remember I really didn't even start drinking beer until I was out of high school. and then we would, typically Miller Genuine Draft, I think that was the beer that I could cop out of the fridge, which I don't think is a beer anymore.
Yeah, I don't know.
MGD.
I remember it.
I haven't seen one in
So what about your worst drink ever?
ever. That's a tough one. I remember like having bad experiences with different drinks, and part of that just being the learning curve. I remember
it's kind of you to not blame the beverage.
I never had a sour beer. Yeah, it's usually my decision making that gets me. But I remember Brett and Eric Coonan, when they found out I had never tried a sour beer, they got a couple sour beers, and they have real sour beers there than their cellar. So that was an interesting experience. But overall, I think the beverage that I think my worst experience drinking is probably the first time I had rum, and I never liked rum because it does not taste good to me at all. But
there you go.
Yeah,
all right, so this next one can be tough to do on call, but you've run with some characters in the brewing scene for sure. So the question is just sort of any go-to funny stories that you find yourself drawing on or telling more often or come up when you're around your pals from the world of Michigan beer.
Probably not that I should share. No. Most of those stories end up with just me saying embarrassing things at that moment. So that's why they become very hard to share in this format. I don't know. As far as like brewing industry funny stories, I'm sure that is kind of hard to pull on the spot. I mean, I think we've all had a story about taking a hose off a tank without closing the valve first. And it was reassuring to find out that other people have had that experience.
Yeah.
The insecure shower.
Was there any classic Brothers Coonan story from those days that would encapsulate what it means to work with the Coonans or drink with the Coonans?
When you work there, you're like having a brother and knowing what it's, being close with my brother and knowing what it was like to grow up with my brother. It's like, they're definitely brothers. I remember asking around one time, I was like, they were arguing about something. And when they argue about stuff, they're brothers. So they, they go at it. And I remember asking something like, does this ever come to, fisticuff or whatever? And somebody's like, oh, probably not since last October, I was thinking, it's kind of always a funny thing, but their personalities are as much as they're different, they're the same. But watching when they would if they disagreed about something, that was always kind of like a moment where you're like, you're kind of watching out of the corner of your eye and trying not to stare. It's always funny.
Yeah. So thank you for that. The last question is, who's a bucket list drinking companion? So somebody alive or dead who you haven't had a beer with yet, but you'd love to.
Honestly, it's, I think having looked at his book so many times, I think Charlie Papazian is probably one of the easy answers for that, just because, I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for that, quirky homebrew book that we all, still chuckle about, but still, you remember things out of it to this day.
Oh, yeah.
Referencing.
Relax. Have a homebrew.
But I think that's probably the one that stands out the most. I know Randy Mosher's book I always found very, very interesting. And I think that would be maybe a fun person to have. He seems to have a really interesting knowledge of unique ingredients and the history
Yeah.
of beer. I always thought he'd be kind of a person to have a beer with.
All right. Well, Charlie and Randy, we got to get yourselves over to Sherwood for a beer. Maybe a porter would be a good one, or a pale ale. But either way, it was great to have you here on the podcast, Ray, and keep on putting beautiful beers in the world. And so happy to have you and Lisa and the whole Sherwood gang as part of the Brewers Guild family. So thanks for spending time with me today. Cheers.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening and sharing while supporting Michigan breweries and craft beer everywhere. The Michigan Brewers Guild was formed in 1997 with its first summer beer festival taking place in July of 1998. Its now 5 annual festivals are dedicated exclusively to Michigan beer brewed by more than 270 member breweries. The Michigan Brewers Guild exists to promote and protect the passionate Michigan beer industry in every way possible. To learn more, visit us at mibeer.com or say hello on one of our social media pages, as we love hearing from you. From coast to coast, from far and near, let's drink Michigan beer.
Let's drink